So I want to offer you all an example of how I use a queer theoretical lens on agriculture in one of my particular research projects, which is about how queer farmers access farmland. And what I find in this project is that for all farmers, people's processes of accessing farmland is really enmeshed with accessing these other key resources, which are labor, credit, and knowledge. And these four resources are also what farmer surveys, where farmers say in surveys that these are the farmers' biggest economic challenges and the biggest barriers to farm economic viability. And what I find in this work is that when you use a queer lens on accessing these four resources, we see different ways that sexuality and heteronormativity is embedded in the process of accessing each resource. So I'll give a quick example of how for each one. So for land access, for queer farmers, especially queer farmers of color, folks were oftentimes reluctant to pursue rural land, which is oftentimes the most affordable land. This is something we've mentioned a little bit in this presentation. But I want to offer the example of what Alex told to me, and it's important to keep in mind here that Alex grew up in a rural area and wanted to return to a rural area, but said this: I want to have my own land, but I'm also nervous about what life would be like out in the country. And I don't want to subject my children to any types of cruel forms of bullying or mistreatment. I also don't want my business to struggle for my identity. If people aren't receptive to queer sexuality and queer gender expression, how will that affect my sales as a farmer? So offering now a queer lens on labor and the labor access process, a queer lens reveals that most farmers and all types of farms typically rely on an intimate partner, either for on-farm labor, off-farm income, or having an off-farm job in the US in order to access health insurance. And because queer folks often, like we have fewer numbers, we're often invisible in rural and agricultural spaces, and because of the rural heterosexism and androcentrism that we've been talking about, it can be really difficult to find intimate partners and queer farming partners to live with you rurally. Moving on to credit, a queer lens on credit access reminds us that the USDA has lost some big court battles for discrimination in the loan access process, particularly for African American, Latinx, and Indigenous farmers, also for women farmers. And one example from the women farmers case, I think, is really relevant here, which is that studies have found that in this discrimination, what happened is loan officers didn't read or perceive women as farmers, so we're less likely to give them loans. So I think when we think about for queer farmers, our ability to get loans is tied up to whether or not loan officers and people with in that position of power perceive us as farmers, which is tied up in identity-based things like race and gender and sexuality. And lastly, I'll mention a brief example of a queer lens on agricultural knowledge access, which is that a common way to learn farming is through apprenticeships, which can be really isolating if you're apprenticing and you're queer and you're not on a queer-run farm. And I think it's important to say that without visible queer community in places like apprenticeships or conferences or universities or other places where people learn agriculture, queer potential farmers can start to feel like this profession might not be for them. So what I'm trying to get at in my perspective here is that an underlying problem in accessing all of these four resources is that in our economic system today, we let land, labor, credit, and knowledge access happen through markets, through capitalist markets. And because markets don't have any sort of internal ways of ensuring or prioritizing social and ecological values over economic return. So what we see, just economically speaking, is that farmers who prioritize social justice and farmers who prioritize ecological sustainability are put at a structural disadvantage in the marketplace. And what I see here using a queer lens, so this is true for all farmers, but when you use a queer lens on that phenomenon, what you see is that to compensate for market failures, farmers of all types rely on this family farm model and the unpaid work often of intimate partners or of themselves in order to access land, labor, credit, and knowledge. And so for queer folks who can't or don't want to follow these traditional ways of doing family and doing farming, they can be at a disadvantage in accessing these four key resources. At the same time, because queer folks often do family in unique ways, some have come up with alternative strategies for doing farming, some of which we discussed in this last section. So now I'll turn it over to Jack to talk a little bit more about questioning farmland access.